we are going to talk about how we can leverage the on-behalf flow, grant flow in SharePoint Framework solutions. I'm Paolo Pialorsi from PiaSys.com, and here you can find my reference on Twitter. So first of all, I will start with some theory, just to better understand what we are going to talk about and to be sure that we are all on the same page. And then we will see how we can use the on-behalf flow in a SharePoint framework. So the idea of the on-behalf flow is just to have yet another option, yet another mode to get an access token in order to consume a backend API through Azure Active Directory when we are using a middleware and we want to consume from that middleware a backend API. So the idea is we have a front end. The front end will rely on a middleware, providing an access token to access an API or a service in the middleware. And in there, in the middleware, we will be able to get yet another access token on behalf of, as the name implies, on behalf of the user, which is in the front end, which is consuming the front end, so that we will be able to consume a backend API, which could be, for example, Microsoft Graph or any other kind of API of your choice, as long as it will be registered in Azure Active Directory. And this will make easy and simple, hopefully simple, to have access to a backend infrastructure of services on behalf of the user from a middleware. Just to try to be more clear, I have a diagram which will explain you how the on-behalf flow works from a functional point of view. So imagine that we have an application where we have an end user consuming that application, and we want to consume a backend service or a backend API through a middleware, leveraging the identity platform in between, the Microsoft Identity Platform in between. So the idea of the OBO flow is that the application will provide or will send a request to the middleware, providing an access token for the middleware. Indeed, in this diagram, I'm already talking about a scenario where the user already authenticated and already got an access token for the middleware API. Once we provide the access token to the middleware API, the middleware API will provide that access token together with a client ID and a secret. So with the client credentials authentication model from an app point of view, will provide the access token, the client ID, and the secret to the Microsoft Identity Platform in order to get back another access token, which will be an access token which will allow the middleware to consume the backend on behalf of the user who is consuming the application in the front end. And as such, the backend API will be able to provide a result back to the middleware as it was the user in the front end making that request. And as such, we can leverage the delegated model and we can get access to information like the mailbox, the personal data of the user. We can send messages on behalf of the user and stuff like that. That's the idea, the basic idea of the on-behalf flow. When we do that, and generally speaking, whenever we consume an API using Azure Active Directory, there is also the need for a grant for the permission in order to have the application consuming an API on behalf of a user to be granted to do that. So how does it work when we have a middleware in between and we use the on-behalf flow in order to consume a backend API? Because indeed, when we use a diagram like the one that I just showed you, we cannot have a dialogue prompting the user to grant permissions for the middleware to access the backend. So how does it work? Well, there are a few options available. One is to define in the manifest definition of the middleware the fact that there will be a known client application for our middleware, so that when the front end will make a request for an access token, the very first time for an access token to consume the middleware, the end user will be prompted not only to grant access to the middleware, but also to grant the consent to access the resources and the services in the backend through the middleware. And that's one option. Another option is to use the pre-authorized application section of the manifest, which will simply define what are the applications that are pre-authorized with a grant for some specific permissions. Or a third option that we have is the so-called admin consent, meaning that an administrator of our tenant, a tenant admin, will grant tenant-wide the permissions to the middleware to call a backend API, which is, for example, the scenario that I'm using in the demo that I'm going to show you right now. So how does this relate to SharePoint Framework? Because what I said so far is just related to Azure AD, to open authorization, and to consuming an API. Well, what if we want to try to use this model in SharePoint Framework, and why it is worth being able to do that? Well, first of all, let's start with a trivial question, let me say. In SharePoint Framework, we already have the MS Graph client and the AD HTTP client available. So it should eventually be enough in order to being able to rely on a backend API. So let's say you want to use Microsoft Graph. Well, you can easily do that in SharePoint Framework using the MS Graph client and making a REST request targeting the Microsoft Graph. However, when we do that in SharePoint Framework, we need to declare in the configuration of our solution, in the Web API permission request sections of the configuration, we need to declare that we want to have specific permissions for our SharePoint Framework solution. And by default, those permissions will be actually granted to all of the SharePoint Framework solutions running in our tenant, unless we use a domain-isolated web part. Moreover, whenever we use and whenever we consume a backend API from SharePoint Framework, we are actually running code which is running in the browser, meaning that if the user will close the browser, whatever we were doing with our client-side code will stop doing that because the browser will not exist anymore as an instance. So what if we need to do something which will need additional processing time, or if we need to run long-running processes in the background, but we still want to do that on behalf of the user consuming our web part or our SharePoint Framework solution? Well, with the on behalf of flow, we can do that. So we can, first of all, rely on a middleware, which will be able to verify and eventually grant or not grant the permissions to do something based on who is calling the middleware, rather than just giving the permission to use that API to any SharePoint Framework solution running in a tenant. And secondly, and I would say more importantly, we can also run background tasks and processes on behalf of the user, which will be processes and tasks triggered from the SharePoint Framework UI, but then executed in the background in a background service running in the middleware. So I think this is a really interesting scenario. And that's why now I'm moving to the demo environment, and I'm going to show you how you can implement that. So first of all, let me share with you that the sample that I'm going to share right now is already available in the sample solution gallery, in the unified gallery that we have under adoption.microsoft.com. In this point in time, it is the very first one because I published it literally today, but it will become always available through this link, which I'm going to share in the chat. And here you can get access to the GitHub repo where you can find the source code and you can find additional documentation. That said, let me move to the actual demo. So first of all, let's see the user experience. This is a very simple and trivial solution because the goal is to show you how to leverage the on-behalf flow model and not to create a really fancy SharePoint Framework web part. But this web part will allow us to specify the URL of a backend middleware, and through that backend middleware, I will be able to make a couple of requests. One will be a simple one, which will simply give me back who I am as an end user, so that I can see that we can read that information through the on behalf of flow access token, as well as will give me back information about how many unread messages I have in my inbox, which could be another interesting information to get. The second part of the demo will still rely on the same architecture, but I will show you a different implementation technique, which is a little bit better and more complete, but a bit more complex to understand as the very first example, and that's why it will be the second one, through which we can send a message in a one-to-one chat in Teams, still using Microsoft Graph through a middleware application. So let me click first of all on the first button, and as you will see, I will be able to get back that I am who I am right now in my tenant, and I can see that I have a bunch of unread messages in my inbox. I can also use this solution to send a message, for example, to my colleague Guido. Let me search for him, and I can send a message. Hi, Guido. All good there. And I can send a message in Teams. In Teams, I have a chat open with my colleague Guido, and as soon as I will press the button, we will see that we will have a new message popping up in the one-to-one chat. Okay, so as I said, this can be easily done also with MS Graph Client, but the key point here is that we are relying on a middleware, so we can do that, for example, in a background tasks or stuff like that. So how does it work? First of all, in Azure Active Directory, we have an application registered, which is in my scenario called SPFX OBO middleware. And in this application, the key information, the key settings you need to be fully focused on are, first of all, the application relies on a client secret because, as I said, in order to get an OBO, sorry, I keep on saying OBO, which is the acronym of on behalf of flow, sorry about that. But if you want to get an OBO access token, you need to use the client credential. So a client ID and a client secret together with the access token that the middleware has got from the consumer. And so we need to have a client secret. Secondly, in the API permission section of the middleware application, we need to declare the permissions that we need in order to consume the backend API. In my sample, the backend API is Microsoft Graph. So here I need to read the user, user.read, read the mail, mail.read. So we need to being able to create a chat, the one-to-one chat between me and the target user. So I need the chat.create permission for Teams. And I want to send a message, so chat.readWrite, still from a Teams point of view. Plus I have the user.read.all because I need to read the information of the user that I want to involve in the chat that I'm going to create. So these are the permissions that I need. As you can see, these are all delegated permissions. So they will be applied in order to execute as someone, as a user, so on behalf of a user. And we have the grant, the tenant admin grant for all of these permissions, and specifically the one that really needs the admin consent is the user.read.all. Now, this is my middleware, and I want to be able to consume this middleware from SharePoint Framework. And that's why, and this is the third and last steps in the configuration of my application, in the expose an API of my middleware application in Azure AD, I also declare that I have a unique application ID URI, which I would advise you to use as a string and not as a GUID like the auto-generated one. So I usually replace the auto-generated GUID with a name which is better recognizable whenever you will need it. My scenario, API, and then SPFX OBO middleware. And then I have a permission scope. You can easily create one more by clicking on Add a Scope and providing all of the information. And this will be the permission that SharePoint Framework will need in order to consume my middleware. And then my middleware in the backend will rely on these permissions on behalf of the user to consume Microsoft Graph in the backend. Okay, so that's it from the Azure AD application registered as the middleware. Now, let's move to the SharePoint Framework solution. And step by step, we will go through all of the layers of the solution. Here we have the web part we saw before. This is a really simple web part, as I told you. The only interesting thing that I do in the web part is in the onInit method. I create through the AD HTTP client factory a client, so an instance of the AD HTTP client object in order to consume my API. And as you can recognize here, this is the app unique ID or URI that I just showed you in the expose an API section of my application. And that's why I want to use a string and not a GUID, because the string can be the same on multiple tenants. The GUID will change on every single and different tenant. So here I simply say, okay, give me a client, an HTTP client, to consume that specific API. And then I provide the instance of the middleware client as one of the properties to my React component, which I use to render the actual UI of my web part. So in the web part, I simply have a really trivial UI where I have a couple of buttons and the people picker from the MGT, because why not, and a text field and a button. So the primary button, the one that I use to just get my personal data, will rely on the get personal data method. Wondering what? Okay, so the get personal data will simply build the URL of the target API based on the base URL that we have in the settings of our web part. So this one, right now I'm running the local version of my function to show you in debug what will happen under the cover. And I have that I make a GET request for that specific URL, and I will get back a JSON response through which I can see who am I, the inbox unread item, and the inbox total item count. Simple as that, okay? When I do this request, under the cover, what happens? Let me do it again with F12. I can see in the network, oops, one more time, sorry. I make a request for get personal data. I target this endpoint in my Azure function, which is running locally in my Visual Studio Code in debug mode. And if I scroll a little bit down, I can see in the authorization header that I have a bearer access token, which is the one generated by the plumbing in SharePoint Framework to give me an access token to consume the target middleware. In fact, if I copy and paste that access token right here, we can see that right now I have an access token for this audience, so for my middleware, and the permission that I have, the scope that I have is middleware.consume, which is the scope that I declare in the expose an API section of my middleware application. Okay, hopefully so far so good. Now, what happens is that when I make a request, and let me do that, let me put a breakpoint in my Azure function. Here I have an Azure function built with .NET 6 isolated mode. I have my Azure function running in Visual Studio Code, and here I can put a breakpoint to show you what happens under the cover. So let me make one more request. Oops, right here. And let me move to Visual Studio Code. And here we can see that, okay, I see that I got my call. I can see if I have an authorization header in the request, and if not, I will complain and say you are not authorized. If I have one, I will get the bearer token that I've just got from the request, from the client request, and I can rely on a utility function that I created, which will give me access to the on behalf of flow token. So let me put a breakpoint right here, and let me show you what happens. So we get the client ID, the tenant ID, the client secret, and the scopes for the permission that we want to have inside the OBO token. And then we rely on the MSAL library, the Microsoft Authentication Library. And we say, create a confidential client application, which is a specific model of client application we have in MSAL, which is useful whenever we want to use the client credentials model. So client ID and client secret. And that's why I say, create one for my client ID for that specific tenant ID with a specific client secret, which is the one I configured in Azure AD. And once I've done that, once I have my confidential client application created, I can say, okay, let's create a user assertion based on the token that I've got from the front end. So basically, I get the access token that was provided to me by SharePoint Framework, and I will use it to make a new request for a new access token, which will be on behalf of the user, but it will be a different one. And in fact, if I go here and I copy the value of my access token, and I show you again with jwt.ms, here we can see, removing the quotes, that we have a different access token where now the audience is Microsoft Graph. This is the unique ID of Microsoft Graph everywhere in the world. So that's why I know it is Graph. And the app consuming it is my middleware. It is doing that on behalf of myself. And here I can see the permission scopes that I have for Microsoft Graph. So this is a fresh new token, which will allow my middleware to run on behalf of myself in the front end. Okay? So most likely now it will be a timeout, but I don't care if it will be the case. I get the access token, the new one, the OBO one, and I make a graph request using the Graph SDK. And I will not dig into the Graph SDK code right now because we are talking about something else, and I don't want to put too many topics on the table. So we made our request, and we have got our information, the user principal name of the user and the number of unread messages in the inbox. So this is the round trip that we make in order to rely on the OBO flow. Now, It is quite a journey. I mean, for example, if you think about the function, well, in the function, you have to retrieve the access token. You should validate the access token. Then you have to retrieve the OBO token. You have to provide it back to Mexograph. So quite a tough journey, I would say. So just for the sake of making our life easier, in the sample that you can download from the sample gallery, you can also find this additional function, which is the send Teams chat message. In this one, I implemented for you also based on another community sample, which I slightly changed and I wouldn't say improved, but I would say adapted to my scenario, okay? I made it possible to have an attribute, which is called function authorize, which you can place on top of your function, and where you can declare what the scope are that are required to being able to call, to invoke this function, first of all. And secondly, you can declare if you want to have the on-behalf flow available, meaning that by setting this flag to true, you will easily get in the code of your function access to the OBO flow token without the need to do all of the stuff that I showed you before manually, because you can just rely on this functionality, which will be based on the middleware functionalities of the Azure Functions engine. This is not a session about the Azure Functions, so I will not dig into it, but you can just see that I can set this flag and say, okay, from the function context, give me the principal of the user and give me the on behalf of token. And that's it. And then you can use it. So again, feel free to download the sample and dig into it. I will not dig into the internal implementation of this functionality, but I think this will be really useful for you to easily and quickly be on board of this new scenario. Now, last thing that I want to share with you before giving the stage back to Gary is that if you want to do that for real in a real solution, you will have to host your Azure function, for example, in a real hosting environment in Azure. And as such, if you will do that, remember that you have to configure the course settings in order to have your SharePoint Online tenant in the list of allowed origins for course for your Azure function. Otherwise, it will not work because of course-related issues. So that said, I think it is quite a long journey to see all of the steps, but thanks God we have the recording, so you can go through it again step by step. And I think this is a really useful scenario whenever you want to have a background task running on behalf of the user, and when the user will trigger it from SharePoint Framework. That said, back to you, Gary, and thank you.
Paolo, before you stop sharing,
sure.
I'm going to jump with the one question. Can you go back on the UX in here? And as you actually showed, as you showed in here, this is a good thing to remind, because we need to be thoughtful about the security and permissions and everything else. The token is visible in here, and that means that if for whatever reason there would be a situation that in the same browser window and session there would be malicious code, potentially that code could actually get access on this token, right?
Yeah, right. That's correct.
We need to be, so that sounds, oh my God, terrifying. Well, yes and no. You can only have that level of a component in your page if you have installed a SharePoint Framework solution to your tenant without knowing what that solution does. So you're basically, as a tenant administrator, that's why we always remind people, you need to know what's in the solution, so that we don't have this theoretical security concern where you have malicious code installed by a tenant administrator, and then it violates and sneaks out potential tokens from other web parts. So it's cool to call out that, of course, we need to know what things we're installing to our tenant app catalog. It's super important.
Yeah, and that's why, for example, in the SharePoint Framework solution, and I forgot to tell it, so thank you, Viva, because you reminded it to me implicitly by saying what you said. I have to declare in the Web API permission request that I want to allow the SharePoint Framework solution to have access to my middleware in order to have this permission scope middleware consume. And a tenant admin of SharePoint will have to grant this permission in order to make it possible to happen. So thank you, Vesa, for the reminder.
Cool.
Good. And that's it for now for sure. That's it for me. Thank you. Yep. Back to you, Gary.
Thanks, Paolo. Absolutely fantastic demo. I really enjoyed that one. I'm sure, I'll be checking out the sample and the recording definitely when it arrives.